the
This
Sundance.
conference will now be recorded.
Um, and so I ended up going to the Sundance Labs from there, and lots of other steps in between. But that's kind of how I got into it.
Well, as a brief scan of Phil's IMDb at this point, it's rather extensive for people who are fans of television shows like Shameless or Revenge or films like Chips, the recent remake with Dax Shepard, Life of the Party with Melissa McCarthy, How to Be Single. Um, Quite a few and eclectic TV shows and films that you've been a part of. So, what was kind of the turning point that took you from doing some of those independent films into doing like major projects?
It's always a sort of incremental thing. There's very few people I know who just suddenly went from sort of doing nothing to doing a giant movie, and that was it. Largely because it's very hard to get a studio gig like that if there isn't some kind of a resume behind you. Studios just won't sign off on a composer that hasn't really done anything in the past. So I think it was bit by bit. It was incremental. I think the indie movies that I was doing were gradually getting more and more festival exposure, festivals like yours, and certainly Sundance and South by Southwest. There was a movie I did called, oh Christ, what is it called? It was called, okay, I forget what it was called. it was.
I will pull up your IMDb and go down the list.
Won the best film score award at South by Southwest that year, which I didn't even know existed. So I got phone calls one night saying, "You won." And I said, "Won what?" You haven't checked the press, have you? So I looked on Deadline, and lo and behold, I'd won an award I didn't know actually existed. And so I guess those movies started getting a little more recognition. And what was the first TV? I also did a little bit of additional music for a couple of other composers, very little, but of the sort of acknowledged paths into film music, into film scoring, additional music, for those of you that don't know, and most of you probably do, but is basically ghostwriting for another composer. When composers get super busy or they have overlapping projects, they often have a team who might arrange one of their themes or something like that. And I did a little bit for a composer called Marco Beltrami, who he's done a million movies, The Hurt Locker, he did Ford versus Ferrari most recently. He's a Oscar-nominated composer. He was one of the first people to hire me, and sort of, very briefly did some writing for him, and then another composer called Robert Duncan, who I did Sean Fox with. And right around that time, they were making the American version of the English TV show Shameless, and I got hired on that. I knew the music supervisor. In fact, the good story about that was, if anybody needs encouragement, or rather an antidote to discouragement, my agent at the time, who shall remain nameless and also fired, told me not to bother going up for Shameless because it was John Wells's new show, and to quote him, everyone and their dog's going to be going up for it. So why would you be even sending in a demo? And I said, why the hell wouldn't I submit a demo? I know the music supervisor, I know people on the show. Like, why wouldn't I do that? So it's just not going to happen. So I did a demo, and I got the gig, which he was super pissed off about because I'd fired him at that point. And that kind of led to a show called Revenge on ABC with Philip Noyce directing. Philip, directed Clear and Present Danger, Rabbit Proof Fence, Salt, lots of big movies. So a filmmaker that I have a great relationship with now, that I'm about to do another movie with. I think maybe my fourth or fifth project with him. And he was, I guess, open-minded enough to like the demo reel that my new agent sent over to ABC, and I got hired on that one. In fact, the story of it was, they all liked my reel, but I walked into the meeting at ABC, first time I'd been to a big sort of studio meeting like that, And when I was leaving, they said, well, we all love your music, but if it doesn't work out this time, you know, we'll make it work on something else. Which, if any of you don't know this, that's Hollywood parlance for fuck off, we're not hiring you. And so I thought, oh well, okay, that's it. So and then on top of that, I walked out into the corridor, and in the corridor, not even in some green room, but like outside the room where I was having the meeting, was sat another massive Hollywood composer who I didn't know at the time. And I walked out and went, okay, well, that's definitely that then. And so I left. And that evening, I suddenly realized that when in our discussions about the music, they had sort of described the piece of music that they were fictionally sort of dreaming up in their heads that they wanted to have as the centerpiece to this show. And it suddenly occurred to me, oh my God, I've written something that is pretty much exactly that, but it wasn't on the reel. So I had my new agent. This was the first meeting they sent me on, and it was a Friday night. And I called him and I said, man, you gotta call them back. You gotta send them this one piece of music. Thankfully, he picked up. See, my previous agent, no way he would have picked up on a Friday night, or I guess I was a new client, so they were humoring me. And they sent the piece of music off with with an email, and I thought, well, not much chance of that landing, but at least we took a shot. And then Monday morning, I got a forwarded email from Philip Noyce that just said, he's a guy, hire him. That was it. And that TV show really put me on the map.
Yeah, and quick scan in the time since. Let's hear, you did 13 episodes of Reckless, 9 episodes of Shameless, 88 episodes of the show Revenge. You've worked on the show Unreal, Notorious, Dietland, What If, Empire, Outer Banks, Council of Dads. And those are just the television shows. Those aren't even the films. Before we delve into it, I wanted to open this up and see if anyone in our call tonight has any questions for Phil.
Yeah, come on. There's only 7 of us. Let's have a chat.
Yeah, Ms. Court. First question: where'd you study?
In the back of a tour bus, mate. I mean, that's partially true. I when I left high school, this was in London. I think round about the time that my despairing parents realized I was serious about this music thing and I wasn't letting it go. So as a parent, they were like, okay, music school, which I have to say I wasn't the least bit interested in at the time. First off, the classical establishment in England was the most stuffy, uptight, white bread thing you could imagine, and just had this strange, and I don't know if this is an English thing or that era or classical thing or what, but they almost had this sort of built-in contempt for the students coming in, like, you don't know anything, sit down, we're going to tell you what music is. Which, being a young sort of metal and punk kid, you can imagine what my response to that was. The only reason I was even vaguely interested in the course was because I had a recording studio and I thought, right, I could do something with that. I could figure something out. But then that summer, so I got accepted into college in London, passed the audition, and I thought, I'm going to take a year out, and travel. And during that year out, I got a job literally sweeping the floor at a local rehearsal studio that had no heating, it was like in a really rough neighborhood in southeast London, where it took me like 2.5 hours to get there. I ended up starting the job in like November, so it was freezing. And I just trekked to this place to basically vacuum the floors and set up equipment and, make cups of tea. And they happened to have a recording studio across the way, like a 16-track, half-inch reel-to-reel studio. And I just gradually pestered them enough that they gave me a job. They didn't give me a job at first. I kind of like barged my way in there and started to just figure out what they were doing and learn what they were doing and learn about the process. And then I had to kind of, you know, apprentice, but very soon it became quite evident that none of them knew what the hell they were doing. So I kind of managed to upstage a couple of them fairly quickly and then, you know, they were like, oh, hire that kid to record the band. So I would do that. And, you know, I didn't go back to studying. And then I was just in bands and, you know, I played with Robbie and that's a whole other chapter. But I didn't get back to studying music until I was in my early 30s. And I was starting to score films. And it was sort of like a bit of a light bulb going off in my head at that point. Like, I need to know more. I want to know more. And studying music in your early 30s is a very different proposition to studying when you're 18. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not so much someone telling you what this is and what that is. It's more you going, oh, that's what that is, because you know most of it already. It's in there. Or certainly the fundamentals, but a lot of sounds, a lot of tonalities were suddenly had names and suddenly had relationships to each other. And it was a beautiful, amazing process that I'm still obsessed with to this day, really. My way into it, oddly enough, was conducting, because BMI happened to run a great conducting course. If any of you guys are BMI members, you should check it out. Run by a man called Lucas Richmond, who was at the time, I think now he's the principal conductor of the Bangor Symphony in Maine. I forget where he was before, but who studied under Leonard Bernstein, and you know was a really great teacher. And at that point, I couldn't even really read music anymore, not effectively, because that's a very perishable skill, and I'd really stopped around the age of 18. So I said to Doreen Ringer-Ross at BMI, look, I'd like to do the course, but I'll probably do it next year because, you know, I need to kind of get my shit together and start learning to read again. And she said, no, that's not how this works, mate. It's a now or never thing. Like, we pick 6 people a year and that's it. It's like a scholarship. You want to do it, you got 4 months to get it together. So I just got a private teacher and I started learning. And as soon as, I mean, it was terrifying standing up in front of an orchestra, and Lucas said, of course ended up getting picked first. Let's see what you do. We'll do Beethoven 1, just the first movement. Off you go. And then I was left standing there with, you know, a baton and what felt like my pants around my ankles. So, but that began a sort of a lifelong obsession with conducting and with just theory and the mechanics of music, orchestration. And I you know, studied at UCLA, took some extension courses, had private teachers, and just studied a lot myself.
It's really interesting, you know, having worked in the music industry before I moved back up here, how many musicians that we would think are incredible, you know, legends, cannot or could not read music. I remember hearing an interview with Elvis Costello just a couple of years ago of him saying that he took a year off to learn how to read music. You think about this guy as an absolute icon for decades, and he had I mean, most musicians, they know chords.
Bands can't, you know, there's no need for it. There was, in fact, I mean, I'm glad I took that way around. It meant I had to work a lot harder. And to this day, when I'm on the podium, if I'm reharmonizing something or, you know, correcting something, I double and triple check myself before I open my mouth, because I don't have that level of confidence that comes from it just being beaten into you when you're a child. Well, it was, but then someone stopped the beating. So I kind of, you know, which was in some ways unfortunate, but in other ways, it meant that I had to find other ways into music. And had I not done that, then I wouldn't be who I am, really. So I'm you know, I'm quite happy with the way it happened, really.
We've had a couple questions show up in the chat room. So the first one is from Kathy, and Kathy asks, is there a film genre that you have perhaps written for a scene, but you haven't found the story to connect it to yet? So maybe like you're writing music in advance for a project that hasn't yet been defined.
You mean, do I write sort of before a film's been shot?
Yeah.
Yeah, on several occasions, actually. It really depends on how a director likes to work. There are some that love you to write stuff in advance, and others that are just like, why would you bother? They don't get it. You know, they haven't made the film yet. Shut up. It really, really varies. There are directors that, you know, love it if I can come up with some ideas, and they might even play them on set, or, you know, use them as inspiration when they're doing rewrites or whatever. And then there are others that don't even want to let me see the film until it's locked. Although that is much more rare now. I mean, look, especially studio pictures where they're continually testing films and testing them over and over and over, and recutting, and, you know, making lots of fear-based decisions. It's very rare for me to see a locked picture ever, actually.
We also have a question from Lori, and Lori asked, how is the process of creating music similar or different for a TV show versus a feature film? Do you have a preference between doing film versus TV, and do you take a different approach to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I look, I love both. I just love, you know, listen, I get to walk into my studio here in the morning, watch movies all day, and, you know, and think of stuff. And that's a good gig. The major difference is TV shows, by and large, you have far less time. So I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of TV shows during my career that have had live orchestras to write for, and I really sort of at a time when that was very unusual, and there were really only a handful of us doing it. I kind of came to that right as, I think, Michael Giacchino really kicked the whole thing off with Lost. Up until then, it was quite rare for a TV show I mean, obviously back in the day it was very common, but there was a long period where people were relying on samples and other instrumentation and not really using orchestras for TV much. Then Lost came along and started up the sort of the demand for it again. But there were really a sort of a handful of composers doing it. There was me, Michael, maybe Bear McCreary, a couple of other people, but most of us weren't that, you know, that lucky. I was lucky enough for Revenge to come along right at that time, and also to have the support of an exec by the name of Dawn Soler, who still to this day runs Disney TV music, who was a great supporter of orchestral music. So to get back to, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but to get back to the difference, in some ways having a live orchestra to write for made it somewhat easier. You would think that was counterintuitive, because you would think without having to do a recording session and prep and orchestration and all of that, you'd have less work to do. But actually making mock-ups, in other words, demos of tunes with samples and stuff, and I'll let you into an industry secret for those of you that aren't composers, is a gigantic pain in the asshole. And making them sound good is really difficult, because you're emulating something that exists in nature with a computer. And no matter how good that gets, it's always going to be an emulation. When you see CGI, a movie that relies too heavily on CGI, your eye is always going to be slightly freaked out by it, no matter how much of a deep fake it can be. It's still just, there's just, it doesn't have the idiosyncrasies of real human movement, and music's no different. So if you have an orchestra that you can write for, once the producers on a TV show and director on a movie are kind of used to the idea that this is sort of a facsimile and it's going to be vastly improved with live musicianship and it's going to sound different and better, you're in a position where you don't have to make these insanely accurate mock-ups. You can sketch a little bit more, you know, to a lesser or greater extent, depending on the people involved. And the final thing is, it's sort of like making an album with a rock band. The final, I hate calling it a product, but the final piece of music comes together on the stage, and then further in the mix room. So, you know, in that sense, that helps when you're on a really tight deadline for a TV show. But really, the biggest difference is time. You don't have the time. Hopefully, you've had some time, if there's a pilot process, to you know, write themes and throw a few things out. But once you're rolling week to week on a TV show, your first idea has to be your best idea. So if nothing else, it's a great training ground. Like Revenge was an insanely good schooling process for me, because not only did I have to write an incredibly inhuman amount of music minutes every week, because at that point, for some strange reason, we weren't allowed to reuse music from one episode to another. So every week had to be something in the region of 30 minutes of music, which would, you know, would normally take me about 3 weeks, at least. Yeah, I was writing that every week, and having to write stuff that I wouldn't be embarrassed standing up in front of an orchestra with a stick in my hand and going, sorry about this, guys. It's the 3 chords for the next 3 minutes, next 30 minutes. So it was a very good composing school, and it was a very good conducting school. And actually, Jerry Goldsmith and several other, John Williams, they all came up in TV. And Jerry Goldsmith had the added horror of doing live TV, where they would literally cut sections of a skit, and he'd written music, and they'd go, I don't know, figure it out. We're going on air in 20 minutes, and he'd just have to turn to the band and go, we're going to vamp here for until this actor says Romeo, oh Romeo, and then we're going to kick into the second theme or whatever. So imagine, you know, how terrifying that must have been.
Well, it's interesting, the symbiotic relationship between music and film. One of my last roles, in fact, my last role in Hollywood before I left, was as a music supervisor, specifically for production libraries. That was my job out down in Santa Monica. And so on a daily basis, you know, think of the job equivalent of being a librarian, but a librarian for 100,000 audio recordings, and talking to film studios and whatnot about, you know, they'd send me a trailer or a rough cut of a new show or film, and be like, okay, what kinds of music would fit well with this? And trying to match mood and melody and beats per minute and all the different factors that they might be thinking about to find that perfect piece of pre-recorded music that you could fit into this. But in Phil's case, you're creating original music. That experience really led me to fully understand and appreciate how music and audio really sets the tone for film, which is one reason why I really love silent films, is to see how the musical scores really kind of accentuated the action. But as a musician who now works on film, how do you see the importance of audio being in making or breaking a great picture?
It's huge. In fact, I was just given, I guess it was last summer now, trying to think of, you know, the years BC before COVID, of what that was like, because I seem to have forgotten. But one of the last live shows I did was a rescore of old silent movies with my friend Nathan Barr, who's and a number of other composers, Sean Carey, Arturo Sandoval. If any of you guys are into jazz. A handful of us, we did a thing for Education Through Music LA, a sort of a fundraiser at my friend Nathan's amazing studio, where he actually had, he bought the old Wurlitzer silent movie organ that used to be on the scoring stage at Fox. It was dismantled in, I think, the early 90s or something, but it was there through the entire silent movie era, through the whole studio system era, and was used on tons and tons of movies. Bernard Herrmann used it on, I think, Day the Earth Stood Still, a bunch of stuff. He restored this thing. By the way, this thing takes up an entire building and like 6 rooms of pipes and turbines and all kinds of crazy stuff. And he built a studio around it in the valley, and we did a show rescoring a bunch of old silent movies. And I was rescoring the famous Odessa step sequence from Battleship Potemkin.
Love it. Yeah.
And so it's incredible because they gave us the freedom to write anything we wanted. And so I didn't write anything particularly sort of old timey, you know, or something that would have felt like a silent movie score. Not to mention the fact that that movie in itself, if you look at the history of it, never really had a score. It had accompanists, like a lot of silent movies would have had in the theater. That could have been an orchestra, that could have been a solo piano player, it could have been all sorts of stuff. but because it was also a piece of Russian propaganda that was used and reused throughout the Soviet era, it was most commonly associated with Prokofiev and Shostakovich. So, so not a high bar at all to have to live up to. And so I wrote, something that sounded like me, because pretty much all I can do. And it was really interesting to see the different effect that a modern piece of music would have on an old, sped up, jerky piece of film like that. And it was really interesting to see how viscerally audiences reacted to that movie. Because if you watch it, I would strongly suggest if you I'm sure you've all seen it, but if you haven't seen it lately, to Google it and watch it with the sound off. You'll see how utterly brutal that piece of filmmaking actually is, and what Eisenstein achieved with that sort of the birth of montage. Because it's often sort of made somewhat comedic by, first of all, the sped up sort of jerky hand cranked camera footage, but also just with, sort of maybe over dramatic music in places where it becomes slightly too melodramatic to be taken seriously. And when you dial that back and try and really get to the heart of what's going on and try and ignore the sort of the hand crankedness of it, it's pretty shocking. So just, to answer that question, if just by swapping out the music, as I'm sure you had the experience in your music library days, to the same piece of footage, you can affect people in literally opposite ways sometimes.
Yeah.
The other thing worth looking at is if any of you have ever Googled Star Wars without John Williams' score, it's the most awkward film of all time. Like what John Williams' score, it's brilliant. I strongly encourage.
In an ideal world, the music perfectly accentuates whatever the visual is, and they're all working together to establish this emotion. But just as easily, the wrong piece of music can absolutely kill a project.
Really?
If people are watching something and all of a sudden the music's just kind of clashing with it, people start thinking, well, that music doesn't sound right. Then you're thinking about the music as opposed to taking in the whole thing. And I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on that. We can talk about that in a little bit, but Curtis dropped a question into the chat room. But since Curtis is one of our professional musicians locally, why don't you unmute and geek out a little bit over the type of equipment that Phil uses? Curtis? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just had to go on mute. Yeah, I was interested, what digital audio workstation do you use? Pro Tools to record with?
Yeah.
And
this is a little clunky, but if I show you here the movie I'm working on right now, it's basically two Pro Tools rigs. So the sequencer and the print and video rig, and then that right there is actually two PCs which run my sample library, or the majority of it being the orchestral and choral template, which doesn't change much from movie to movie. I might tweak mic settings and all of that stuff, but all of those are controllable via MIDI on this sort of rather ancient, but I just happen to like them, these old PB controllers. So for instance, right here on the left, I'll have all of my sorry, the camera might be flipped actually, I've just realized because of
that's okay.
It's not bad. But these controllers over here will be your volume expression, all that kind of stuff. And over here on a lot of the libraries now, you can literally map different mic positions for, say, a string library. This might be the surround mics. This might be the outrigger mics. This might be the tree. This might be the close mics, right? So really at your fingertips, you have the potential to mold that orchestral sound quite drastically. Other than that pretty much just stays on all the time and stays there. We're actually about to redo the whole rig whenever I get a break, which is to say you're not really going to need a print rig anymore. Because this is, if you went into my machine room, you'd see, racks and racks of fairly complicated gear and wiring. We use MADI to get audio from the sampler and the sequencer into the print rig. It all sort of meets in a mix environment. That's kind of no longer necessary with the way technology's come on. And that's really an idiom that Hans Zimmer's people came up with 20 odd years ago that's still being used, but is starting to die out because the host for all the samples, which is Vienna Pro, VE Pro, now kind of works better over LAN, and you can actually render things in real time. And it's way more reliable than it used to be. So a lot of that gear is kind of getting downsized quite soon, and thank God.
My other question is for recording music for film and TV. What is your sample rate and bit depth?
I'm sorry, say
record?
that again. I'm sneezing.
What's the sample rate and bit depth that you record for TV and for movie?
Right, 24-bit 48K.
Okay, just curious. I didn't know if it was going to go up to 96 or something. If they're going to start making it more.
There's no real point. I mean, I know there are recording engineers that love recording orchestras in, you know, the highest bit rate humanly possible and highest definition possible. I'm not sure how much I like that, because I'm one of these old fogies that still likes tape, let alone, you know, however many bits and whatever. I don't know that it makes that much difference. You know, I've recorded with engineers. I think there are far more important factors to consider when you're recording an orchestra. Much more to do with the miking, the room, how the orchestra plays. So I find it fairly unnecessary. You honestly couldn't tell the difference. I think on most things, and especially once you put dialogue and explosions and rockets taking off over the top, it's like, was that 128? Was that 96? Was that, you know, you obviously want it to be the highest quality possible, but I'm not the biggest fan of clean, polished edges. I'm not the guy you hire for that particular gig. I like
Well,
it.
and if you're working on something that's for a feature film that's going to be in theaters, that's one thing. But if you're doing something for TV, most people are just going to watch with built-in TV speakers as opposed to like a whole sound system. So
no, I mean, that's
is it really going to?
That's not necessarily true. Yes, there were certainly people that would take that position, and it feels a little bit lazy, because at the end of the day, you might want to have a soundtrack album. You might not be seeing it at theaters, but there are a lot of people with home theater setups now with 5.1, 7.1, Atmos. You know, you get Atmos binaural headphones now. Like, I'm a big gamer, and I just got a pair of Xbox binaural Atmos headphones that freaked the hell out of me when I first put them on, because it was like, fuck, someone's sneaking up on me from behind. You know, it's so insanely accurate, where you can pick from a stereo pair of headphones something that's really done with impulse responses and reverbs and stuff. So you can't quite get away with that anymore. You know, I mean, because if you were to take that argument, you could say, well, people are going to watch this stuff on a cell phone half the time. Well, then why bother having music at all? Why bother having, you know, why not just, you know, do it on a dictaphone? Why not record your music on an iPhone? And, you know, obviously you're not going to do that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was watching something the other day about post-production for HBO's series Westworld, and they had to shut down because of COVID right before they were doing all of their post-production audio voiceovers. And so some of the actors had to just re-record their lines basically through their phone, like sitting in their car. And send those off to HBO.
And actually, cars are great because they're a totally small, dead space, which is what most, I mean, we can get into remote recording. I just recently had to record 2 episodes of Empire, show that I just finished for Fox, that I've been doing for 6 years, remotely. So and right now I'm actually working with a third-party company and roundabout through Microsoft, working on a remote recording solution for orchestra. So we're beta testing things now. But one of the things that kept coming back was when you record musicians remotely, they're all, as opposed to, you know, an orchestra in a room, they're all in different rooms, and all these rooms sound different. So at that point, kind of the less artifact you have from your environment, your recording environment, the better. So we used to do that on Empire all the time. I remember sitting on the stage with Lee Daniels at some point, and him not liking some line that an actor had when his face was off screen. and him calling him up right there. And he's like, "Where are you?" And you can't get your phone out. I want you to say, "Give me my money," or whatever the line was. And no, not like that. Say it again. And okay, send it to me. We literally texted a performance straight to the dub stage, and we flew it in and made it work.
And I'm certainly curious to know, since so much of your work is involved of being in a studio with a full orchestra, how you're able to still work right now when there's restrictions against doing that kind of thing. Were you like in the middle of a project, then suddenly had to shut it down and figure out, okay, are we going to Zoom orchestra this now?
I
Or
was in the middle of several. I was just starting a show for Disney Plus. I was finishing one for NBC. I was finishing Empire for Fox. I had just finished one which didn't have live orchestra, the Outer Banks for Netflix. I'd just finished another all synth show for Netflix Germany, and I was just starting a movie for Netflix, which is what I'm working on right now, which is a superhero movie with ostensibly a 100-piece orchestra and a 60-piece choir, and you'll like this, and a thrash metal band. There's a character in the movie, I'm not giving away too much, but there's a character in the movie that's kind of a throwback to 80s metal, which is something I grew up with, and bands like Slayer and Anthrax and Bad Brains and Dead Kennedys and all that kind of stuff. And so I started including some of that in the writing. I'm having a whale of a time with that. But yeah, we were actually going to be recording at Abbey Road this week, and clearly that's not happening. Funnily enough, I just saw a post from one of the engineers at Abbey Road on Instagram, and they actually started recording sessions today. As far as I know, all they can do is strings and small groups of strings, because they can wear face masks, they can be 6 feet apart. They kind of figured out the engineering workarounds for that. But if you think about choir, if you think about if you think about brass and woodwinds, that's literally a bunch of instruments that are designed to launch a virus across a room at a great distance. So I think
projectile virus spreading.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally what it, if you think of a French horn, it's like, see it.
Yeah.
And I think, as far as I know, they're still recording those elements separately, but strings, which in a way were the sort of the biggest challenge, because, if you think of 15 violins and a single violin section, they do not sound like 15 violins. They are way more than the sum of the parts. They are their own sort of collective set of harmonics and overtones, and that is not what you get when you record 15 violins separately. You get something very, very different. So there's a lot of trickery and a lot of adjustment to writing that has to happen for that to work. But yeah, I mean, we were going to be at Abbey Road this week, and that's been put off, and I'm still on the bright side. That means, I have more time to write the movie. On the downside, we don't really know when we're going to record it and when we're going to be able to travel to London. It's anybody's guess. But there were things that I did do remotely. Like I said, with this Disney show. And so right now, one of the things I'm involved in is in talks with Disney and Microsoft and a couple of other companies in trying to find more of a real-time solution, because at this point, remote recording really is just sending tracks and getting tracks back. People record in their own time, you get it back, and then it's just a nightmare of editing and trying to shoehorn it into something that sounds like an orchestra. You can really only write certain specific things. Like, for instance, I'm on my third movie with Melissa McCarthy and her husband Ben right now, and the last movie we did is a movie called Superintelligence, which is coming out some point soon on HBO Max. And that was another big orchestra and choir, and a lot of it was with no click. A lot of it was, to streamers and punches, which for those of you that aren't familiar with that, is basically the original system for synchronizing music to picture. It was all done visually. So At that point, you would see a line to get it, for the conductor to get a cue. You'd see a line going across the screen and then a blip, and that would tell you the downbeat of such and such a bar has to land here. Say there's an explosion there or something. And the way they used to do it was literally to take a dupe of the film, lay it into a sort of a ruler with a trough in it, pin it at both ends, and scrape the emulsion off against a ruler of each frame of film so that it looked like a line was continuously passing from left to right. When it got to the punch point where they wanted a downbeat or a musical moment, they would literally punch a hole in the film so that the light of the projector would shine through the hole in the film and you'd see a white blip, right? They're often things called cigarette burns in film reels too. You might have seen that in Fight Club. Brad Pitt talking about it in Fight Club. Same sort of principle, except now it's all computer generated. But the good thing about that is when the orchestra isn't locked to a click track. With punches and streamers, you have the conductor has way more of an ability to flex the timing and to create rubato passages with the orchestra, because they're following the conductor. They're no longer listening to a click. When they're listening to a click, unless you're a very good conductor and you've sort of got a good command of the orchestra, they're not paying much attention to you. They don't need you as much. They need you for certain things, but they'll be fine without you. Take them off the click and they're yours. So then you suddenly, if you can actually conduct, you have the ability to pull them forward or back off the timing. And that's really what, classical music isn't really metronomic music for the most part, unless you're talking about Steve Reich and Philip Glass and those kinds of things. If you talk about Beethoven, Mozart, Mahler, anything really, those aren't rigidly timed click track pieces of music. So if you want that kind of a feel, you have to be able to go off the click. Now, trying doing that remotely is all but impossible. You could, create some crazy tempo map that would mimic that, but then try getting, 100 tracks of solo recordings, all each with their own interpretation of a varied click, and edit that together and make it sound even remotely musical. Not something.
On that note too, obviously every industry in the whole world right now has been put into a very weird place that we haven't seen in a century. Our guest last month was a Hollywood screenwriter who talked about how Hollywood is adapting with, so many productions shut down right now. We're finding alternate ways. And right now he said, people are reading scripts now more than any other time.
Oh yeah.
Because suddenly they have the time to do so. So from your side of things, how is Hollywood coping with not being able to go into full production right now?
Well, the truth is they're not. I mean, the reality of it is that everything is ground to a halt. I just happen to be lucky enough to have a project that was already shot that I'm working on. There's a lot of animation being greenlit, as you can imagine. I'm actually working on a video game / animated project that's been a pet project of mine for a while, that I'm also a producer on, and that's continuing to happen. But live action is all but wiped out at the moment. I did read recently that California and New York are submitting plans to Gavin Newsom and to Cuomo about resuming filming, having COVID compliance officers on set, dividing the crew into quadrants, all kinds of stuff. We'll have to wait and see what effect that has on COVID numbers, and there's no vaccine in sight right now. Nobody seems to be very hopeful that there's going to be anything this year, certainly. It's going to be interesting to see how COVID numbers go up after this week, when there've been, countrywide demonstrations everywhere and vast numbers of people suddenly gathered together in a way we couldn't have imagined a month ago. Obviously very necessary, but it's also scary to think what the results of that might be in terms of COVID infection. So I think I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the next month, because I hope I'm wrong, but I would imagine you'd see the COVID numbers go up, because people have been gone from isolating to suddenly gathering in very big numbers. I wonder how that's going to affect films going into production, and where the people will take another step back and go, oh, maybe this isn't such a good idea yet. But who knows? I mean, I also know that the industry is desperate to get back to work, just like every industry is. You know, people are losing their livelihoods everywhere. And that's not in America, that's across the entire world. So I think by hook or by crook, people will start filming something. I think it will be far sparser than, you know, than it has been, because the other tenet of this new shooting protocol that everybody's talking about is that if the crew's divided into quadrants, I think they may have already tried this in Australia. I don't know how it's gone.
Yeah, they've been Australia's been kind of the test site. Yeah.
Right. So if somebody gets sick in one of the quadrants and they furlough that crew for 2 weeks and bring in day players and then so on and so forth. So you can imagine what that does to the continuity of a film, but you can also imagine that, you know, we're learning new stuff about this virus every day. And for a while it was, don't wear masks. Okay, wear masks. Don't wear gloves. Okay, wear gloves. It's 2 weeks. Oh, it's 3 weeks. It's 6 feet. Oh, it's 13 feet. It's, you know, so I'm just taking the position that we don't know jack shit at this point. And it could go any number of ways. I'm sure we'll see, you know, a few films being made. I mean, there's a ton of stuff being greenlit, you know, because like he said, there's a lot of people reading scripts. There's a lot of people wanting to make movies. I have 2 or 3 things on the starting blocks that, you know, are raring to go, but at this point.
Yeah. I've been a part of a lot of calls with the Oregon Film Office and what up here is called OMPA, or Oregon Media Production Association. And this has been the main topic of discussion, is what are the steps to safely film? And right now it's very prohibitive in terms of the amount of personal protective gear that needs to be on set, what needs to be available to crews, how often people need to be checking their temperatures, makeup. Yeah, so,
well, the problem is that you could be completely asymptomatic and be a carrier. So that's what's made this whole thing such a fast spreading disease and so deadly, is that, you know, you don't have to be sick. So checking somebody's temperature, it's kind of not a guarantee of anything. I wouldn't say it's a completely moot point, because you could tell if somebody actually is sick and at least you can quarantine that person. But outside of that, there are no guarantees, you know. I mean, look, it's interesting. I happen to be a lifelong, you know, martial arts fan and watch the UFC a lot. And they've been one of the first sports that have gone back to hosting events, albeit with no audiences. But you're talking about combat sports where people are literally in close contact with each other for long periods at a time. And then you've got, you know, you had a fighter 2 weeks ago when I forget if it was their first or second post-COVID event, but that tested positive. And obviously they tested everybody going in, but he tested positive immediately. 2 of his cornermen tested positive, trainers, you know, and it's exponential and it's so quick that I wonder what data there is available from what they've learned that might be imparted to film crews.
Yeah. I know that sports are starting to come back. Bundesliga has been back in action. I'm sure you're excited for Premier League to get started up. Yeah, but Bundesliga has been showing on ESPN.
Oh, I had no idea. That seems.
Yeah, and Premier League is supposed to be starting up again in a couple of weeks. They were talking about American football coming back in the fall, which, I mean, you want to talk about contact sport.
Well,
I mean,
right. No crowds, right?
Yeah. Let's open. Any questions from folks for Phil? I know we kind of went off on a tangent there with COVID stuff, but you know, it's relevant to film productions or preventing film productions from being made.
Court, I got a quick question. Just have you noticed changing stylistic trends in scoring? Like, for instance, now seems to be a lot of sort of soundscapes as compared to, like, back when I was doing it, it was very, very melodic, you know, and you were being asked to do, you know, these really strong melodies and harmonies and stuff like that. With the exception of romantic comedies now, there's none of that, you know.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think there are I think there are small sort of arcs of trends and then larger overall. I try and ignore them as much as possible because my what I try and do, and I don't always succeed, is to kind of operate somewhat under the aegis of what you see is what you get. In other words, if you're hiring me, you're hiring me. You're not hiring me to sound like somebody else, because otherwise, hire the other person. And my personal stock in trade has always been themes and melodies. So in that sense, I haven't been on many projects. There's maybe been a couple, but I don't remember ever really being on a project where they didn't want to hear melody or something thematic. I've certainly heard about that trend a lot, and I've certainly seen films where that would be true. But then, if you think of a film score like, let's say The Revenant, for instance, that was relatively recent, which I think is brilliant and an intensely atmospheric score, especially Ryuichi Sakamoto's side of it, which is interesting because his side of the movie was more the thematic side, even though, you know, the theme is really sort of 4 chords rather than a melody. But it's definitely a signature of sorts. And then there were other more ambient artists, as you just sort of described, that scored a lot of the movie, and that was certainly appropriate. Certainly I felt like it was. Not every score can be Star Wars, wants to be Star Wars, wants to have that kind of romantic score. But to that end also, you know, themes don't have to mean Star Wars. Orchestral music doesn't have to mean Star Wars with Indiana Jones, you know, with big fanfares going on and stuff. So I think there are increments within that where, you know, if you're talking about trends of thematic versus non-thematic, more atmospheric versus more overtly symphonic, say, or whatever, I feel like it's all still there. You know, I do think there was a trend for a little while of just copycat music, and I think that's a different subject. I think temp music infiltrating the likes of franchises. You know, particularly when you look at Marvel and things like that, where they sort of established somewhat of a sound, but then you look at a movie like Black Panther, where, you know, Ludwig, who's a friend of mine, you know, created something very unique. I also had a very unique director who fought for his vision. I think, to answer your question, that there isn't a clear answer. Certainly there is a tendency to say that back in the day, whatever that is, if you're talking 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a tendency for more melodic scores. But there was still, you know, if you think about horror scores from that era, right? You think certainly into some cheesy territory, but kicked off by, say, if you listen to John Carpenter's scores, you know, a little 5-note ostinato is his theme, right? But very like repetitive, loopy, atmospheric scores, certainly super effective. I think it's all existed at any given time, and I think if you look at, there are some great composers out there that you would consider more minimalist, say like, you know, the late Johann Johansson. Certainly wrote things that weren't massively melodic, but incredibly memorable. So I really think there's degrees of shades of gray in all of it. I don't think any of it's gone away as such. Certainly not for me, but I can't speak for everybody.
Well, doesn't some of that get driven by, I mean, don't directors ask you for things? I mean, I got in it at a time where almost everything I was getting asked to do was electronic stuff. It was, you know, it was all synth stuff or whatever. Right. It was, you know, the 70s.
When was that?
That was like the mid to late 70s. and
Right.
then like Spielberg stuff took off and Lucas's stuff took off, and all of a sudden everybody was calling me because I knew how to work with an orchestra.
Right.
Yeah, and it just flipped like overnight.
Right.
So
There's certainly some of that.
so the trend was driven kind of that way by what was the hits hot at the time at the box.
Yeah. There's certainly some of that. I mean, there's certainly, and the funny thing is, I find often the more stifling directions come from studio execs and producers that are maybe not so creatively involved with the film but want to be, or are based on, I've been in situations of doing a studio movie where, it tested well, and the score, the temp score tested well, whatever the hell that means. That means, Poughkeepsie and Jim and Bob from Poughkeepsie liked it, and when we like it on the test card, and then, they're like, okay, do that. And it's a constantly malleable process. It's always you've always got a fight on your hands trying to do something original with somebody.
Yeah,
But
I have seen it. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Phil. Sorry.
I was just going to say that the more of a repeat relationship you have with some directors too, and with some producers, the more I find that there's A, sort of a shorthand, and B, they just trust you a little more and may even give you the movie without temp, or just say, don't worry about the temp. Like, this is my third movie with Ben and Melissa. And at this point, I did see the movie with temp, but it was very kind of sparsely temped. And they were just at the point where they're like, don't worry about it, Phil will figure it out. Which is, a wonderful position to be in. It's still rare, by the way, but yeah.
One trend that I've noticed lately on that conversation is that the grand epics seem to be going towards more of a subtle approach. But we've been seeing in the last couple of years, I remember, Heidi and I went to go see Dunkirk in the theater, and we were on the edge of our seat because that entire film was driven by the score, which was very subtle, but it was also nerve-wracking in the way it was this constant drone of a clock, kind of like keeping the tension up. And you'll watch on TV, when it came out on HBO or whatever, and I was like, it's an okay film. But in the theater, because of that score, it was like, whoa, this is intense. The same thing happened with 1917. Where is a very subtle score, and yet that film,
Incredible.
so on the theater is so immersive, and that music just drives that constant dread. And I don't know if that's going to translate to DVD, Blu-ray in the same way.
It's interesting. Those two films I think are really great examples, actually, because Nolan is one who, is sort of almost notorious for having his music louder than the dialogue in a few places. His movies are incredibly music driven, right? Be interesting to see what Ludwig does with Tenet, actually, with his new movie.
Yeah.
Whether that has the same approach as Hans did, but yeah, he sort of. In fact, the first time I went to see Dunkirk, I love Chris Nolan's movies. I think he's incredible, and I think it's so heartening that there are genuine sort of, insofar as anyone can be an auteur out there, still getting to make these big budget movies and have them make a lot of money. And they're not franchises. They're not based on a comic book. They're not, nothing wrong with those either. But that there are standalone ideas out there that are being made on a grand scale for a grand medium. I think for that reason, I was pretty shocked that I didn't like Dunkirk the first time I went to see it. Now, I went to see it at the ArcLight. I went to see it in I don't think it was even in Atmos, but I didn't love it, and I was kind of perplexed because I'm a huge history buff with definitely a sort of specialization of in World War I and World War II because of my own family heritage. I've had a lot of interest in it. Big sort of war movie buff. Love Chris Nolan. I think Hans Zimmer is a total innovator. Like him a lot musically, I think you can't take that away from him ever. And I went to see the movie, and somehow left me a little bit cold. And I was sort of pissed off that I didn't like it. So I went home, and the first thing I did was watch an interview with Chris Nolan saying, please, please, please see this movie at the IMAX. That's the medium it was meant for. It's not even a movie. It's almost like an installation or a roller coaster ride.
Mhm.
So I went and saw it again at the IMAX, and I had exactly the experience you described. I was completely just locked in it. And that time, and the first time I didn't like the score either. The second time I loved it. 1917 was similar. I went to see that. I don't think it was at the IMAX, but it was. I think it was in Atmos. And I remember thinking, even for the places where the score was very subtle, there were a couple of places where I was just going, no, I don't want to hear a piano here. I would want it to be sound design, actually, to sort of, to your point, to more sound designy scores. There were places where I was just like, this is so fragile here that I feel like any musical language would ruin it. Whereas later in the film, he brings in this very sort of Vaughan Williamsy orchestral material that just absolutely hit me right in the heart, because especially since, I mean, Vaughan Williams is more closely associated with World War II, but very British. Same thing in Dunkirk, when you're talking about the bringing in Elgar at the end, the arrangements of Elgar. They're very quintessentially British pieces of music that, certainly as someone having grown up in England, even though I'm not British originally, hit me right where they were supposed to presumably hit me, So actually, cool. It's interesting that in 1917, I feel like has a bit of both. Has moments where it's just pure sound design, and that creates the feeling of dread that I think music would have a hard time doing in the same way. And then the moments where music is that much more effective for it, because we haven't been bombarded with musical syntax through the whole thing.
Yeah, totally. Do we have other questions? Lori or Kathy or Heidi, or I know Amber, you're hanging out with Curtis as well. Any other questions for Phil? While everyone searches for the unmute button. If not, then we'll just keep talking, because I haven't had a chance to catch up with my buddy here in quite a few years. So it's great to talk to you and talk shop a little bit and hear about all these various projects you've been working on. I
just
am a
want to
little
say thank
curious.
you for doing this. This is Curtis. I just want to say thank you for doing this. It's been very informative and nice to hear you talk about all of your experiences. It's just wonderful. So we appreciate it. I was going to let you know, I sent an email to Kurt. If you're into analog gear, I know a guy that's retiring, and he's selling all of his Otari multi-track machines and reel-to-reel machines. He had a tape transfer.
Please do put me in touch. I've got a newfound interest in tape machines, but more for I've been using sort of stuff like the old Nagra tape machines, which any film students among you would know.
Oh yeah.
And then just old 70s reel-to-reel sort of home hi-fi machines for making tape loops and making. There is an entire world of ambient artists on Instagram that do incredible soundscapey stuff in the way that sort of Cage and Stockhausen used to. Very, very sort of old school methods using cassette 4-tracks and Nagras and stuff like that. I mean, as far as like old Atari machines I used to have one of those back in London. I did my publishing deal with EMI right before I moved to New York. This is like around the year 2000. Talking of naivety, I got, I think, a $50,000 advance, which I didn't realize was, I was going to spend the next 10 years paying back at extortionate interest. And, typical rock and roll story of like, oh, I'm fucking rich. This is great. I've got to look at this check, 50 grand. Like 50 grand, thinking that was, I was rich now. And I went and bought a tape machine. A tape machine. What the hell was I thinking? It was like the worst investment of all time. This thing was the size of a refrigerator. You could barely get it into my studio. It took up half the room. And then when I moved to New York, like 6 months later, this thing was worth less than a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
Totally useless. But I mean, great bits of gear. Now I might be interested in having one nowadays, but.
Yeah, he's got the auction's like 38 pages of stuff. I mean, many different styles of multi-track Ataris, quarter-inch, got some old Ampex stuff, just about everything.
Love it.
Kurt has the link, and he can forward it to you.
Yeah,
Yeah, Phil, I will send you the email tonight with the link so that you can check that out. I just got in the last couple of weeks, and I'm still trying to kind of sift through all of it just because I've been so busy. But we have a local thrift store here in town that was kind enough. They were just getting ready to reopen, and they said, we have a bunch of old camera gear and other equipment. I'm not sure if it'd be any use for you, but why don't you come on by, and anything that you find, go ahead and it's yours. And so I spent an hour or two digging through a lot of just old stuff, most of which wasn't much use at all. Old archaic stuff. There was still kind of cool history pieces like World War II Brownie cameras and stuff like that.
Wow.
But I did find fresh in the box still a Super 8mm player and
awesome.
like a whole collection of like Disney films on Super 8 and some oddities. We got this this tripod, which is they had it posted for $5. This is about a $300 tripod. Very nice Bogan tripod that we've added to the Klamath Film collection. I was like, I'll take that. Thank you very much.
You're going to tell them that? Good grief.
Yeah, so sometimes thrift stores they don't realize they're going to treasures they have. It shows that if you dig long enough, you're going to find something cool. There's also an old slide projector, and I found a bunch of old. I need to go through it. A collection of slides from like World War II of some family that grew up locally, and everyone was deceased.
Wow.
Somehow it got donated. And one of these nights, I'm going to go through and just check out I looked at a few of them, like, this is like World War II era, like family photos of some family in Southern Oregon. And I love discovering stuff like that. I discovered a couple of years ago, I had someone walk in, because my day job is as a newspaper reporter and a newspaper editor. I had someone just walk into our office who had discovered the footlocker of a World War I veteran who from New Mexico who had somehow ended up in Oregon. And I had to connect the dots. It took about a week of researching this family and trying to figure out the photos and everything. It was the favorite article, my most favorite article I've ever done. But coming across those kind of lost treasures and having to sort of connect the dots is my own little sort of Indiana Jones adventure there. So I'm looking forward to doing that.
You need a school.
Yeah, we did have Kathy drop out, but she did leave a message in the chat room to say thank you very much, and that this has been really enjoyable for her, and to stay safe and stay creative. So for anyone else on the call, do we have any other questions for Phil at this time? We've been talking music for a while now, and Phil and I could talk music for hours, but I don't want to bore people here.
Okay.
Give it a couple seconds for mics to unmute if need be. If not, I'm curious, Phil, and I know you said it tends to vary sometimes, but at what point in the typical production process does scoring come into play, and at what point do you start working on things?
It really varies on film to film, and I think it's less variable with TV, because TV, like I said before, has such a compressed schedule usually. So it's really, you get the gig, it's very, very quiet, it's quiet, and then go, and then you're just off, because you're usually up against air dates, or now, a stream.
Everyone's waiting on you, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like you're waiting on them, and then all eyes are on you. And so you might have some time to do a little thinking about it, and maybe come up with some ideas based on a script. But if it doesn't exist yet, basically in TV, once it exists, you're working. Before that, you can kind of meditate on what it might be, but that often changes pretty drastically. So and with film, I've often been I often get hired before a film's shot. But not necessarily to the extent that I would be writing stuff. It really depends on who it is. I do like that. I love it when there's a sort of a symbiotic relationship where, we're writing and editing at the same time. But it really varies. And
we always hear about the dreaded word of reshoot for films, and somehow that comes into play, where a lot of people assume that if a film is having a lot of reshoots, it's going to be terrible and it's kind of DOA on box office arrival. But from your side of things too, if a film is essentially done and they're testing it out and you've already worked on the score, and then they decide, no, we need to go back and change stuff, how much do you get dragged back into that process? Do you have to completely rescore stuff too when
Again,
things are
it
being
really
reshot?
varies on what they've reshot. You know, if there's an existing piece of music that would fit there. I mean, that's where a great music editor really comes into play. But to be honest, most of the time, it'll end up being something that just didn't exist in the film that's fairly drastically different. And so you end up having to write more music usually.
Okay. Court had to drop out as well, but he said that this was his favorite meeting yet
Oh, well,
that he's come to. So
and actually, I'm gonna have to go put my kids to bed, so I
yeah,
think it's the point where
yeah.
I'm gonna leave as well.
Okay, so maybe just one or two questions, then we'll call it a night. Phil, thank you so much for taking some time out to talk to us about this. This has been fascinating. So, we try to bring in someone each month that has a little bit of a different niche within the industry to talk about their aspect of stuff. So we've had directors and producers, and I'm lining up some more folks, but we hadn't had anyone come in to talk about the music side yet. So this has been really fun for me. For those left on the call, does anyone still have any questions for Phil? If not, I'll let him put his kids to bed. Lori or Heidi or Curtis? Oh, Heidi did say that Phil totally got street cred with her son Connor when he mentioned the Xbox headphones. So.
Ah, yeah. Tell him if he's playing Call of Duty or Warzone. That's worthwhile investment.
We just recently added an Xbox One to our collection, so I will have to add you on as a friend, and we can battle at some point. So that was actually one of my stops in the industry. For a couple of years, I worked as a game tester for
I think I
a
remember
couple
that.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I worked at EA for one game, and then I worked on 7 games at Insomniac.
Right.
So it gives you a totally different perspective on as with films and with music, with anything else. When you see how the sausage is made, it gives you a different idea of the process.
Well, at some point, probably not for a couple of years, but in a couple of years, you'll see the game that we're working on right now. I'm pretty stoked about it.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like everyone is calling it a night, so I will say goodbye as well. But Phil, we need to catch up at some point. It's been far too long. It's been great talking to you. And for those who were able to make the call, appreciate all of the insight and input. And we will do this again first Thursday of every month from 6 to 8 o'clock. And hopefully soon we'll be able to do our meetings at our regular location of the Waffle Hut in downtown Klamath Falls and be Skyping people in for whoever our featured guest is. And I don't know, Phil, if you get time off at some point, come up to Crater Lake and hang out. And mid-September, we're doing a film festival. So maybe it's an excuse for a business trip.
That sounds great. Is there skiing up there?
Oh yeah, we've got Mount Ashland. We've got a ski resort about 100 miles east of us, which is a small hill, but a very out of the way hill. So there's few people on the slopes, which is great if you want to maximize your time. And Mount Bachelor is one of the biggest ski areas on the West Coast. It's I think second largest, only to Mammoth, and it's up in Bend, just a couple hours away from us. So
that's me to come up. Love to ski.
Yeah, we've got some really great ones up here, and we got a spare bedroom if you need a place to crash. Well, if you pass through Klamath Falls, it'd be great to catch up with you. But this has been great tonight. So as a reminder for our Klamath Film members, your membership does give you ticket discounts to the current ongoing Ashland Independent Film Festival, and for the next about hour and a half, the SOU, Southern Oregon University Student Film Festival, is live streaming right now. So go check that out tonight. That's going to run till about 9 o'clock. So I will say good night to everyone. Phil, great to see you as always.
Good to see you too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
All right, bye.
Bye.